Welcome to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show, and thank you for being with us. Our topic, leadership, focuses on leaders such as yourselves. We believe that leadership is a skill that can be learned through practice and awareness. It is our hope that our conversation will help you become more reflective when it comes to your own leadership practices and enable you to leave a positive legacy. Our very special guest is Dave Stachowiak. Dave is the host and founder of Coaching for Leaders, a top-rated leadership podcast downloaded 9 million times. With more than 15 years of leadership at Dale Carnegie and a thriving global leadership academy, he helps leaders discover practical wisdom, build meaningful relationships, and create movement for genuine results. Dave is also the lead faculty for the Coaching for Leaders Academy, a year-long leadership development cohort. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, Biana. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
Dave, I'm so happy that you're with us tonight. You are the host and the founder of Coaching for Leaders podcast. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you do.
Well, thank you. The podcast is designed to help leaders discover wisdom through insightful conversations. So since 2011, I have done my very best to create a space where we can have great conversations with people who have wisdom in a particular area of leadership and in human performance, and to then bring out those ideas so the people who are part of our listening community can then take a practical action and go out into the world and apply them in a way that is useful and also helps them to get better results.
Can you share some of the wisdoms that you learned while interviewing folks?
Well, about interviewing, I think the biggest thing that I have learned is first and foremost, and this actually relates right to leadership. I think there are two big things. One of the things is to listen for what is said and also what is not said. And that may seem like an obvious comment, but one of the things that I have heard from others who do interviews, whether on podcasts or even in situations with employees, is that they find themselves, and I certainly did early on, of thinking about what's the next question as someone is talking, and also sometimes scripting out questions. I know I did this early on when I was interviewing people. And even when I would do this professionally, I was a consultant and salesperson for many years. I would often walk in with a list of scripted questions. And what I found over time was that the more scripted my questions, the poorer a job I did listening, and I often would miss things because I was thinking about the next question and not thinking about where the conversation was taking me. So what I've learned as an interviewer and as a leader and as a coach is to listen for what people are saying. And then by listening, that then informs what I may say next or may not say next. The other piece of that goes hand in hand is the willingness to be curious. And I've often found that if I will both listen and then be willing to ask that follow-up question because someone said something that either I didn't expect or they took the conversation a slightly different direction, or maybe they didn't say something that seemed like an omission for whatever reason, then I often find myself asking a curious question on my better days. And when I ask that curious question, more often than not, that changes the tone of the conversation, that surfaces something that's really valuable, that helps me to discover something about them or their work or the situation that I didn't appreciate previously. So those two things, both listening well and then the willingness to be curious, have certainly served me well as an interviewer.
And I appreciate that you mentioned about asking additional questions because in my experience, the first answer that you get is not actually the answer that they really want to give you. But the more you actually keep asking, you can actually come to the bottom of the whatever subject you're covering.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, Biana, because we assume that if we ask the question that someone's going to just answer it. And that just isn't human nature for most of us because we've conditioned ourselves as a social norm to say certain things in certain situations. And I think that finds its way into a lot of our business conversations, a lot of our leadership conversations, a lot of our learning conversations as well. As often the first answer is the answer that we think we should give, or the answer that sounds good, or the answer that the other party is expecting. And like you said, a lot of the time that isn't the full answer and it isn't the full story. So if we're willing to stop for a moment and to ask the second question or the third question, that opens up the possibility to then engage at a deeper level and to earn trust with the person that you're wanting to connect better with.
For me, curiosity and clarity go hand in hand. What are your thoughts on that?
I hadn't thought about those two words together, but as you say that, I think that there's a lot to be said there. And here's an example of it. Years ago, I was asked by an organization to come in and to propose building a coaching program for their staff. And I was very interested about the opportunity. It was in my wheelhouse. It was someone that we knew and had a good relationship with. So I went in and had the meeting and started asking questions, as I'd learned to do over the years when we'd start a new project, and asked a whole bunch of questions about what they wanted in a coaching program and what kinds of things people were running into in their organization and what were the pain points and what were they finding wasn't working. And we had this wonderful 45-minute conversation about things that had absolutely nothing to do with coaching in my mind. They were about other things, management 101 skills, basically, from what I could tell. Things like delegation, how to give feedback, things that are very important in the work of good managers and good leaders, but didn't really have a lot to do with coaching. And what we discovered is that we were using different definitions of the term because of some of the cultural norms of the organization. So what I called coaching was not at all the same thing of what they called coaching. And that's fine. I was not certainly right, and they were not certainly wrong. It was just we had different frameworks for the language we used. Once we discovered that, then it was very easy to figure out how do we use the right language going forward that's going to serve the people we were trying to serve. So curiosity and clarity do indeed go hand in hand. If you're willing to be curious, then the clarity emerges, doesn't it? And it gives you a chance to then do a better job serving than you would if you weren't willing to be curious.
And it made it clear to you what they were actually thinking, right?
Indeed. And another thing that I find myself often doing, Biana, is asking for an example, because there are so many terms and language that are very general in the business and organizational world and are used differently in different organizations. And so whenever I hear something from a client or a colleague, and in some cases, even people, when I've worked in a more traditional role in an organization, if I've heard this from a manager, something that sounds to me a little more generic, that maybe I can't quite pin down what it is they mean, I will often ask, tell me about a situation where you're running into that right now. And I find often that if I am willing to ask for an example or two or three, that those examples will then very clearly illuminate what that person means by the word strategy or leadership or coaching or whatever other word it may be. So that's been super helpful to me over the years on creating some of that clarity as well.
What are the top 3 or 4 leadership challenges that guests have shared with you when they were on your shows?
The things that I hear often are, how do I coach more effectively? The leaders of the last generation were often charged with having answers to tough questions. My parents, my grandparents, when they were in leadership roles, they were expected to have answers. And in the digital world, where we all have access to almost any answer through the internet and through Google and all the other tools that so many of us have these days, information is not a problem. It's context that's the challenge. And so one big shift that I've seen, is certainly in my work and with our clients and our academy members, is leadership today is much less about having answers and much more about asking the right questions. And that is very challenging for a lot of us in leadership roles, because many of us have been trained well to do the jobs we did super effectively, super efficiently. We've gone, many of us, into higher education programs that said, if you get an A, that's good. If you get an A minus or a B plus, not good enough. You need to knock it out of the park and get it perfect the first time out of the gate. And the reality is real leadership isn't like that most days. It is a process of asking questions and surfacing what's going on and being willing to step back and to be curious. That is a real struggle for almost everyone that I work with, and certainly amongst our guests that are on the show. It's something that's often articulated as a challenge. Another one is being able to surface good feedback and useful feedback that's helpful. And I think this is also something that's really challenging because we do unintentionally have ways of kind of hearing what we want to hear and also sometimes not getting the most accurate information that's out there. Here would be an example of just in the last couple of weeks, someone said, they'd really like to get better feedback from the people on their team. And one of the questions that they were going to ask was, where do you see me really failing in a particular situation? I don't remember the exact context. But one of my thoughts was, it's really hard if someone works for you and they report to you for them to just kind of off the bat, especially if you haven't done it much before, to be telling you what you're not doing well. That's a pretty uncomfortable situation for most of us to be in. Yes, there are people who will do that, but that's the kind of thing that probably puts people in an awkward position. What is potentially a bit better is to say something like, hey, I'm working on getting better at being more concise in meetings. What's one thing that I could do in a future meeting that you think would help me to do that? Because then it gets really specific. We ask for a future piece of advice versus criticize the past. And so I think that it's really incumbent upon us to think about when we're getting feedback of how do we keep it forward-looking? How do we create an environment where people are comfortable giving us feedback and in a way that's really practical?
And also creating a culture that people feel comfortable to share and not feel that they're going to be reprimanded or retaliated against.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've all heard the term, don't shoot the messenger, right? And yet, unfortunately, that's the culture in some organizations. And so what people do, people who don't know better, they become the messenger and bring bad news. And most people only do that once. When they get punished for bringing news to senior leadership or whoever in the organization that needs to hear it, and the response is negative, then they learn very quickly, don't bring bad news to the boss, right? So that's a loss for the organization as far as culture and as far as helping that organization to learn and not repeat mistakes. And those are the kinds of things that ultimately lead to organizations not performing well.
What can leaders do to change or shift the culture?
There's so many places to change and shift. And first and foremost, it comes from leading by example. So one place that I think that is helpful to look at is where are people at in the organization and what are the current things that they're struggling with? What are you not hearing? What is not working? I love what Edgar Schein, who is a leading thinker on organizational culture, has said over the years, that culture isn't necessarily good or bad, but it's up to the leaders of the organization to decide, is the culture serving the goals of the organization? And is it serving the clients and whoever the customers are in that organization well? And if it is, then that culture is working. And if it isn't, then it's not. So I think it's really incumbent upon us, as if we have the privilege to be in a position of leadership in an organization, to decide, if it isn't already decided, what is this organization doing? Why do we exist? What are we trying to do to serve people and organizations or whoever the customer is? And is the culture doing that today? And if it is, great. How do we continue to do a good job of supporting and strengthening that culture? Southwest Airlines is probably the best example of that. Ginger Hardage was on the show a while back, their former senior vice president of culture. And Southwest Airlines has a wonderful culture that supports enthusiasm and excitement in the workplace. And they have doubled down on that big time to support those activities happening in their organization, because they found that that is one of their amazing competitive advantages. But you may also come to the opposite conclusion, right? Which is, we have a culture that isn't supporting what's happening in the organization and for our customers. And if an organization comes to that conclusion, then it's first and foremost up to the most senior people in the organization, especially the owner and CEO, to decide that we need to make a shift and to lead by example on that shift. I've seen so many examples of organizations that have had a wonderful change initiative, that a group of employees or a few employees have gotten together and decided that they're going to do something differently as far as culture or change. And for whatever reason, senior leadership or the top person wasn't involved in that, or maybe they gave some lip service to it, but weren't really fully engaged in that effort. And the change effort failed, or, maybe some minor things were done, but it wasn't really done effectively. And oftentimes that's because there wasn't the recognition from senior management of the importance and the drive to fully support it. So before an individual leader goes in and says, I'm going to try and change the culture of this organization, first and foremost, my invitation to them would be, is senior leadership on board with you? And if they aren't, those are the first people to go start talking with, because your efforts to change the broader organizational culture are very difficult if you don't have that buy-in from the top people.
Do you believe that you can have a good culture when it comes to client services, but not so good culture when it comes actually within the organization where people are exhausted and not so happy where they work, but they can actually provide good services to the clients?
Indeed, yes. And I think that's a big challenge for organizations today. I've heard it more than once from our Academy members that it's all about the customer. Everything that the customer says is first and foremost the number one priority, to the point of it being detrimental to the culture within the organization. And the reality, of course, is if you're going to have a healthy organization, you have to do both. You have to both serve the customer well, but you also have to take care of people internally. So yeah, very possible, sadly true in a lot of places, and probably not sustainable in the long term for most organizations.
And as a leader, how would you bring that balance into the organization that it's so unbalanced in so many ways?
It comes back to the senior leader in the organization, or the owner or CEO or executive director, whoever that is, of setting the example. So if that person is always the person who's saying it's all about the customer, then that's a real struggle for that organization. Yes, there are things you can do within your own team, but that's a real challenge for you and your organization. So that's the kind of place where you might think about, like, where else can I go that I can really have a better balance on that?
And possibly not being afraid to speak up.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that is always a judgment call. There are times that it makes sense to be the person that stands up and say, hey, I really think we could do a better job at this. And here's 3 or 4 other people in the organization that are kind of with me on this. Let's talk about how we can get better. And there are also times when if you stand up and you're that person, you might get ostracized in the organization, or it may not be the smart thing politically to do. So I think part of it is just having a savviness and talking to others in the organization, the industry, about what's the right timing, what's the right way to influence on this. Is this a place that I can influence and make effective change? Or is this something that it's not practical for me to advance on for whatever reason?
So obviously, to influence folks, we have to have a good visibility. And my question to you is, how does one create a sustainable visibility for either organization, company, or individual leader?
Well, for the organization or company, that for me is more as a marketing question and also a customer service question. So first and foremost, it's serving people well and then sharing those stories. So if you're a organization that, for example, is a marketing firm and you're reaching out to help other organizations to tell their story better, a good marketing firm is going to do that really well through all the right mediums that is relevant in that customer's industry. And then they're also going to do a good job of sharing those stories with others and maybe even teaching others along the way. That's part of what I've done with Coaching for Leaders is, yes, we share the stories of our customers. And even before we do that, we teach. So people who aren't even our customers can come along and to learn and to grow along with the people who are our customers. So that's part of the way we do that. So from an industry and organization standpoint, that's how you raise visibility, and you do that consistently, right? So it's not just once or twice or occasionally. It's doing that in different mediums and consistently so that people see the value that you offer. On an individual level, there's a big piece of leaving breadcrumbs along the way of the value that you add to the organization or to the team. For example, there's the belief that good work should speak for itself. And I wish it was the case that if you could just do a really good job at something and produce A+ results, and that work would speak for itself. And that just isn't enough most places. Most organizations and leaders are not going to just see good work and automatically tie it back to the person or team that did that good work. It is up to each one of us to be able to advocate for the good work and to teach people about the work that we've done. And so sometimes that means literally getting into a meeting and saying, hey, I did this good thing. Here's the results I produced. But more often, it's leaving breadcrumbs along the way. It's sending a weekly update to the next higher person in the organization, talking about the accomplishments that the team has made that week. It is surfacing testimonials from customers in the quarterly report that's going to go to the board. It is talking about the wins that your individual team members have had when you get into the next higher level staff meeting and highlighting those wins and how people are learning and how they are growing and helping others in the organization, in the industry to put together the connections that we're here doing great work and here's the evidence that supports that.
How do you strike the balance where you're not self-promoting, but you're kind of advocating, so people are not over annoyed by you constantly reaching out and sharing?
So the way that I found to thread that needle a bit is speak in the terms of how this is good for the organization, what Dale Carnegie would call the nobler motive for why we're doing this, right? And also pointing to third-party evidence. So rather than just saying, hey, I had this great result on this number on our metrics 2 weeks ago, it's, hey, we had a great result on these number of these metrics, and here's the result that accomplished for our customer or for our organization or for our industry. So you're going toward the bigger picture stuff, right? It's not about me, me, me. It's about us, us, us. How does this help the organization to perform? How does this help the customer? How does this help my boss to do their job better? So framing good things you're doing in the context of how this produced organizational results, how this helped the customer, how this helped the broader organization. You may say something similar, but it's under that context, which is useful. The other thing is third-party evidence. For example, I don't get online anywhere and say, hey, I have a really great podcast. You should go listen to it. That sounds bragging, right? But it doesn't sound bragging if I cite a third party that's saying something about me. So, for example, I might say something like Coaching for Leaders has been recognized as one of the top 20 podcasts in iTunes in the career section. So then I'm still talking about what I do in the context of my good work, but I'm talking about it by using a third party who's validating what I'm saying.
How do you do that if you're just starting out?
One key area for me is finding other people who can support you in that. We had on the show recently Julia Taylor Kennedy, who is from the Center for Talent Innovation. And she was talking about sponsorship and the distinction between what we traditionally think about as mentors and now what you're starting to hear the term more of sponsors in organizations. And the distinction she made is that mentors talk with you and sponsors talk about you. And I think that that's a key distinction of finding people in your organization who you develop good relationships with, who you produce wonderful work for, and then people who are willing to say good things about you. And so I think that part of this is just starting and building great relationships with people, because if you have great relationships and you're willing to serve people well and you're willing to support your boss and your colleagues, people are going to want to help you. And then if you're willing to make that ask when you need that help, and you're willing in turn to help them when they make that ask of you, I think that's a really wonderful place to start.
Any thoughts on generosity and leadership?
I think sometimes we mistake generosity for things that aren't as helpful. Here's an example. One of the most popular episodes we ever aired on Coaching for Leaders was called The Way to Stop Rescuing People from Their Problems. And the reason that was so popular is because it's a challenge that a lot of leaders have, which is oftentimes, if you're in a role as a leader, you got there because you were really good at the last job you had. So you were the best top performer. You were the top salesperson on the team and you became the sales manager. You were the top engineer in the organization and so you became the engineering manager. And it is really, really easy to get into that new role and then have other people come to you in the organization that you now lead and say, hey, I'm having trouble with this, or I don't know what to do here. Can you help me? And to then say some version of, oh, sure, I'll help, or I'll do this part for you, or I will jump in and sit down with you and help you do your work for the next day. And to think of that as generous. And that is not generous. That is doing someone else's job and ultimately robbing them of the experience to learn and to grow. So for me, being generous in those situations is to have a coaching conversation, is to ask questions of what have you tried? What can I do to help? And to have them to articulate to you what it is that they need or where they've tried or what they failed at. And then to, yes, provide coaching and support, but also then to encourage them to go back and then to take the action that they're thinking of, or to connect them with the right resource, or to help clarify expectations. That for me is generous. What isn't generous is doing the work for them or putting it back on your desk or jumping in and rescuing them. Because one, that's not the work of a manager. The work of a manager is to really help the whole team to perform, not to be the individual contributor. But the big miss is you miss the opportunity to help that person to learn and to grow and to work through that challenge and to discover a new way of doing something. So you really rob them of the opportunity for that professional development. And more, that's what people want in the workplace today. They want the chance to learn and to grow and to get better.
And what is your mission in life?
Right now, it's helping leaders get better through good conversation.
Any final thoughts?
Leadership is really challenging. It's also a lonely place for a lot of us. And my invitation to anyone listening would be is to find a community that would work for you, to begin to share ideas and collaborate so that you can do a better job of asking those questions instead of just zeroing in on the right answers.
And how can people contact you, learn about Innovate Learning?
Well, the very best way is to go over and just search for Coaching for Leaders. And there's also a ton of resources available on the coachingforleaders.com website. One of them is access to my free audio course titled 10 Ways to Empower the People You Lead. It is a abridged version of the experts and the wisdom that we've had on the show since 2011 in 10 bite-sized audio lessons. So if you're looking for a place to start on how to lead more effectively, that's certainly a great place.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest.
Biana, thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks. Our special guest was Dave Stachowiak, the host of the Coaching for Leaders podcast. Thank you for tuning in and listening to the Leadership with Biana Kovic Show. Remember that you're all leaders in your own rights, and the impact that you're meant to achieve starts with small acts of kindness, curiosity, and generosity. Please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you again, and until next time.